Ben, I thought it'd be good to have a conversation today about, everyone talks about location, but why is that? It's the land that underpins that that's really important. And I guess what we want to distinguish today is the difference between short-term spikes and value increase over the longer journey, and what differentiates the two. Because quite often you can have short-term spikes in demand that exceed supply in areas that don't necessarily have the long journey in them, but they have this really short spike. So what we think that it's really critical for any property investor who wants to play a longer game, not that sort of short-term game, a longer game, to have a really full and rich understanding of what grows out the land value.
That's right. I mean, if you think about the whole concept in economics of price discovery, what's basically happening usually in price discovery is demand supply. So if demand exceeds supply, usually that's going to put pressure on price and ultimately raise price in the short term. But when you start thinking about property, we know of examples like Gladstone, when obviously all that gas projects were happening in the, I think it was around the early 2000s to around 2010. So there was a lot of rush into that particular market. And so demand absolutely exceeded supply and values took off. But only was it real gold or was it fool's gold that they ultimately got into? Because those people who got in at the end, where values got to upwards of 400, 500,000, only to fall back to sort of 250 to 320,000. So there was a lot of people who, if they had have just looked at demand and supply, would have said, well, there's short-term gains here. So I thought what would be a really good idea is the discovery around what's sustainable over the decade. So what's going to make your property portfolio skyrocket over the long term, as opposed to just being caught up in the hype that can happen when it comes to supply and demand.
Yeah, so there's three ways that we think that I think the key word was sustainable. How do we get sustainable increases in value in the land? And so there's three ways. So the first one is kind of creating a visual of someone who stands in, if they were to stand in the middle of Australia, smack bang in the middle of the desert, and they were to look around for as far as the eye could see, it probably wouldn't take much money for someone to get a massive parcel of land in that part of the world. But the big question is that productive? Is that the most productive use? That's probably at one end of the spectrum, and we'll work our way to the other end of the spectrum. But so it's not just about having land, which we're very strong components of. It's about having productive land.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful segue into just sort of trying to paint a picture for our viewers. So if you did broad acreage farming, then your per acre square metre would be judged on how much yield you're able to get out of that. So that's what we talk about productive use. Then if you move to, okay, well that's rural land. What about, let's start talking about residential. When you start talking about residential, what you're looking at is, well, what's the size of the land that I've got and what is its productive use? So a good example, if I'm a developer, so if I put my developer hat on, I'm sort of then saying, well, the more production that I can get on the land, in other words, the higher that I can realise that. So if I've got a site that goes to 5 metres, so that means I can build maybe sort of 15 apartments. But if I have got a site that can go to 60 metres high, I can now build effectively hundreds of apartments on that site. So effectively the square metre use of that land is more expensive. So we know from the person who owns the land and is potentially trying to get that productive use, that's why land in the inner city CBD areas is so expensive, because they can go higher. So their productive use is higher. Now, we're not those types of investors. We're the mum and dad investors. We're that aspiring Australian passive small business investor. We've still got to look at that concept. And so we've got to look at the concept in terms of, so what we're looking for is land and its productive use. And so we're sort of saying, well, if you put a freestanding house in a suburban area, but that is on 1,000 square metres versus the other lots of property that are being subdivided or whether are on 400 square metres, and you've got a scarcer item, think about that from its productive use. It hasn't realised its productive use yet. So effectively there's a margin of safety in the idea of having a larger land size. Don't confuse that with lots of vacant land, because there's no demand in lots of vacant land.
Yeah, so we're trying to build out the spectrum here, aren't we? We go from the desert right through to someone who has broadacre farming,
Yep.
and then they have more intense farming,
Yep.
and then it might be someone who has a hobby farm, then someone who has a lifestyle lot, and then it becomes a residential lot.
Yeah.
And then when it becomes a residential lot, is it a house? Is it a townhouse? Is it a unit? Is it an apartment? And again, getting those productive uses. So we're kind of breaking down one component of it, but the long-term viability of land is largely determined by congregation of people. So if we go back to that
100%.
that original sort of seed plant was, how many? If you're standing in the middle of the desert and you sort of look, how many people are you going to see? Not many. Hopefully a camel, but not many other people, right? But as you come closer to where the people are, and we're going to go into that in a second, what brings people into congregation, but wherever there's congregation of people, that is where there's a correlation between the productive use getting higher, because they go, well, just by supply and demand, by water finding its own level, just by the sheer necessity, the productive use will increase because of the congregation. And that's an important point.
Bryce, in a biology sense, humans are social creatures. If we were designed to be non-social creatures, guess what? That land out in the middle of nowhere would actually be worth more, but we're not designed that way. We're designed to mingle, congregate, socialise, and that's been in our DNA for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years, right? So with that in mind, and if you then start thinking about what a town offers versus what a city offers, we all know that there's this gravitational pull to these central business areas, because ultimately I get so much more. So by way of example, if I'm in a small country town, I'm unlikely to even have a hospital there. I might have a locum doctor, like I'm talking about a small town, right? I've probably got one school in which I can choose from. I've probably got one pub, maybe two pubs, but not really a restaurant, because there's not that sustainable thing. But the closer I go in and to the broader population centres that I go into, all of a sudden I get incredible amenity. I get cultural amenity, I get entertainment amenity, I get health amenity, I get educational amenity, and I get work opportunities in those bigger centres. And so when you start to think about all of that, and then you start to overlay the convenience associated with that, you start to then think about why developers and then why investors look at the productive use of that land, and why we have governments who talk about windfall taxes, where they change the zoning of that. There is an immediate uplift in the value of that land. And that's why, obviously, that's a classic example that we know that its productive use is then allowed to change based on the laws of the society that it's in, and off we go. So that's one critical element, is its productive use, but it's not in isolation. There are a couple of other elements that come with that.
It's a wonderful point, because if we just said that's all you
That's
need,
it.
well then that means the most productive use of any land would therefore be the most expensive, but there's not. There's actually a spectrum. So
Correct.
It takes us to, I guess, the second point around, largely a little bit around human behaviour and status
very much so.
of the location, because if we've gone from the desert to the smallest apartment, and that's your spectrum of the productive. Where is the point on that spectrum where the status brings it back to finding where equilibrium is for the most status on that productive use spectrum?
Yeah, well, I think you nailed it in your show. Location, location, location. Why do real estate agents talk about location? I mean, you can be, by way of example, you can be even in a suburb, Bryce, where there's hills, so the topography is up and down. Well, if you're on the higher part of the hill and you've got city views or ocean views or lake views, your land ultimately has a price point that is higher than potentially being down in the valley or on the other side of it. And so those things matter to humans and to owner-occupiers. They're paying an envy price. They're paying a social price. They're paying a status price for those types of things. And it's reinforced to us in terms of shows like The Block and Grand Designs, and obviously in the work that you did on those shows in terms of trying to find properties that represent the individual. And if they're successful, they want to show a lot of that status through the property that they own and basically all of the amenity around that property?
I think social class is something that I think we've been privileged growing up in this country, that those classes that you get in Europe, you know, the social status classes, we haven't necessarily had much of that. We're a culture that has a go, we're a culture that has the great Australian dream, but I feel like there is a bit of a pivot point now that if you actually think about the class status in the UK, for example, it's usually underpinned by land ownership, property ownership, and the widening gap between those who can have land ownership and those who can't. Well, in Australia, we have been blessed that the great Australian dream is something that we've all grown up thinking we're getting. But I think we're at that pivoting point now where if you fast forward 20, 30, 40 years, that social class will start to come into the conversation, because there are a bunch of people who can afford to get into the property market on their own.
Yep.
The next layer of people is the people who can't afford to get on their own, but they've got someone to help them get in, bank of mum and dad.
Yep.
And then the third group is largely those who can't afford to get in, those who don't have someone to help them get a leg up, so therefore they won't get in, and that's where that class division will start. And so it'll only become more prevalent over time around the status that enables you, to your point, to have that position up on the hill, or in some cases, forward projecting 20, 30, 40 years, the status will just become from actually being able to get onto the property ladder in the first place.
Well, it's everywhere, Bryce. Whether it's a bottle of wine, in terms of paying $1,000 for a bottle of wine or even more, to cheese, to dairy, to meat, Wagyu beef, like it's everywhere in terms of people's ability to be able to afford and want to afford. And then if you also transition in $3 trillion worth of generational wealth that's also going to be passed down, ultimately we're going to be in a real strong position where that value is. So these societal biological drivers of feeling worthy they're not going to change. In fact, they're being amplified by social media, or as I call it, social envy.
I like how you describe it.
So that is going to be reinforced. So $1,000, $10,000 handbags, $2 million watches, $30 million, all of those things will be more and more prevalent, and those people will get to choose where they want to live. And then it is a ripple effect. Ultimately, affordability does play out. So, but it's not going to change the other way. Like at no point in time in terms of land ownership is it ever going to be in reverse. No one can show me any economic data that will say all of a sudden the remote areas of the city or the city fringes are going to ultimately outperform. If those city centre areas don't perform in terms of higher productive use or status, then those property prices or that land value will not move. It's only that ripple effect that makes those properties move. So
comes back to the idea of congregation, isn't it?
Correct.
Where does the congregation most want to hang out?
Yep.
In clusters, which will ultimately drive it. So I guess if we think about that as a framework then, so we've gone desert to the highest productive use, not enough on its own. So we need to overlay that with human behaviour, status, classes. So now we've actually got a measure of finding like the sweet spot on that spectrum, but it's still not enough, because if we were to go, okay, we're in the desert and we'll find a location that has a congregation of people, and then we can get the status of those people, no problem, but it's missing the third element, because it could be a short-term reason why that congregation is existing in that place. So therefore, those two layers are not enough. It's a third layer we've got to bring in.
All right, so let's introduce one of the classic ones we talk about, which is Castlemaine versus, say, Hawthorn, right? And let's wind ourselves back to the 1880s, 1890s, when the gold rush and Melbourne became per capita one of the wealthiest cities in the world.
So let's set the scene. Hawthorn, inner city of Melbourne. Castlemaine is gold mining town. It's a couple of hours drive from
hour and a half from Melbourne. So obviously driving 100 kilometres wasn't so in the Cobble and Co coaches. It was probably a couple of days travel. But come back to the principle. So we saw Victorian mansions and Edwardian buildings going up in that time for those people who may have been selling the shovels and picks and owning the land, or had the tenements for the mining to be happening. So they built beautiful homes. And the same beautiful homes that were potentially also built in Hawthorn So you've got apples for apples in terms of the improvements on the land, but during that time, the economic activity in Castlemaine was booming, and so you would expect that land values would have continued to grow at that point.
Big congregation at that point in time?
Definitely people moving there. You would have had the inns, you would have had entertainment. All of those movies show our old sort of developing country and society out in those areas. But also then Melbourne, you know, Dame Melly Melba, one of the great opera singers in the world, living in Melbourne and performing at our beautiful theatres and all. We got all of those things built off the back of that gold rush. That's why Melbourne is the cultural heart of the country. But then you say, okay, what happens? Melbourne's economic activity and becomes a trade centre and diversifies in its industry. Castlemaine is a one-trick pony in terms of gold. That starts to dry up, and then you see that shift of population, the gravity pulling back everyone to the centre. And what happens to the land in Castlemaine? It stagnates. It goes slow. It does not move. But what did you see for the land in Hawthorn, Camberwell, Kew, Malvern, all of those areas, Toorak, you know, they all start to move up because, again, you're talking about that productive use, that economic vibrancy, the ability to earn income, the commerce that's occurring, that building that commerce that goes on in that particular location. And all of a sudden you have all of the formulas, the universities that get set up, the cultural, the arts, all of that is feeding in on itself. And it's a vibrant ecosystem and economy, and that's ultimately why you've seen land values appreciate greater in those particular areas. So you can't miss out on this idea that what's going to happen to our mega cities versus obviously our regional and rural towns. They are always potentially going to struggle unless there's, you know, sea changes or green changes that bring a population there. So lifestyle drivers will still see ocean towns and all that potentially get, and general population will lift that, but it's not going to do as much heavy lifting as the big cities do. And ultimately, when you then look at over 50 or 100 years' time, that economic activity, the higher wages that come from that, the reinvestment into those areas, the old knocking down of those old homes and the 2 townhouses being built next to that single freestanding home, that's adding value to that freestanding home because they haven't realised that full productive use. All of it starts to come together.
It is just if people can really grasp what you just said,
yeah,
there is gold in them, their words, right? Because in case it was lost, you could have the exact same house structure in Castlemaine
yep,
and Hawthorn, but the value that someone's prepared to pay for those 2 pieces of real estate that are at face value identical, beautiful, ornate fixtures and fittings yep, throughout. They've got the ceiling roses, appeal, they've got yep, the beautiful bullnose verandas.
Charm.
They're just charming,
beautiful,
charming properties. Exactly the same, but because they're in different spots, makes a big difference. So if we really do overlay that, then what we said is start with productive use.
Yep.
Then you go, we need a bit of human behaviour in the mix to go, where's the status sit in here so that we can be where it is?
Exclusivity, yep.
And then what you've said is economic activity, and I think it's beautiful. I think COVID demonstrated that beautifully because there was a rush back to Castlemaine.
Yes.
Wasn't there?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so people went there, but now what's happening is the water is finding its own level, and it's like the tide went up and the tide got to Castlemaine, but now that tide is actually going probably to that hour and 15-minute commute mark because people are still going into where the congregation is biggest for longest because the congregation moved up there for a bit, the congregation moved to Gladstone for a little bit, the congregation moves around a little bit, but ultimately these big cities, and so we're talking about Melbourne, which is a metropolis in this country, but let's zoom out even further. We go to New York, we go to Hong Kong, we go to London, like any of these mega cities that drive commerce and economic activity, the same thing applies, that the productive use is at its most efficient where the status of the people want to be, and it's underpinned by the fact that they can get access to economic, you talk about this a lot, the economic flywheel in that particular city that builds this momentum that means that people can have access to not only great income, but things to spend that income on when they're not working, which creates communities, which creates demand. And so those 3 things, when you tie them together, productive use, status, and then economic activity help you understand how do you play this game, because we talk about playing a decades game. How do you actually buy an asset for a decades game rather than buying an asset based on very short-term indicators that suggest there is a short-term spike going on that's undeniable in this suburb or this region or this SA3, right?
Yep.
But over the long term, will it sustain?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, anecdotally, there's the classic story of the couples going to Noosa, and they're all coming back to Melbourne now because Noosa was just too boring for them. So that's a classic case of, if you've only got one street, and you've got the beach, what else is there? So you will see those ebbs and flows over time, but ultimately those big engine rooms, the gravitational rooms where, and Bernard Salt talks about the attraction cities, right? That's where the talent lives. That's where, that human capital, that invention, that innovation that goes on. Melbourne's got obviously CSL, where we're talking about all of that classic work that they do in the scientific area. Those are the types of game changers and big industries that just bring those, those talented people in to look at pharmaceuticals, to look at all of those types of things, education, financial services, legal, all of that sort of makes up that, that dynamic industry. Whereas you look at regional towns, you're like, or maybe they've got a university, maybe they've got a hospital, so they've got something happening there, and lifestyle's good, don't get me wrong, but is it enough? And so usually for most people, that social element, that DNA in them wanting to get back to those cities, and then that will ultimately be a consistent driver of land values in those centres.
Let's bring this home, Ben. Let's really nail these takeaways. So first of all, the first takeaway you need to be clear on as a property investor: are you chasing short-term gains, or are you investing as a true investor with a view to just holding it for the long term? Depending on what your answer is on those two will depend on what you chase.
100%.
So the assumption here for our philosophy is chasing the long-term gain. So therefore, we want to be investing in areas where productive use is high, status is on show, and we can actually work through and see what that is, but also the economic activity has some consistency over the journey. So if you can decipher which of those two categories you're in, will give you a better chance of knowing what type of property you're chasing. Because if you're chasing short-term gains, you're just going to run around. You've got to be very good at technical craft, knowing where it is, getting in, making sure there's a margin by getting in and getting out. But if you are like us and like what we mentor our community on the podcast and our community of clients, it's really about, understand these things that we're talking about, buy the right property when your cash flow comfortably allows, so that you can have an eye on being in the biggest economic activity centres, that you can get that productive use of that land around.
That's right. There's no doubt that people will play in that more affordable space and look for those short-term gains. There's lots of ways to make money in property. That's very true. I think when we're playing with other people's money like we do in our business on a day-to-day basis, when you start to overlay things like how challenging do you want the tenancy arrangements to be? Like, what sort of tenant do you want to attract into your property, and is that a thing for you? Well, most of the time, poor professionals that we're working with are like, wow, I just sort of want it to be a passive business that I'm running, not so much an active business, and I don't want to have those stresses. So when you then define those things, it's like 1, 2, 3 really good properties held for the long term. If that's you, great. If you want to build a property empire and you want to trade and do all of that, good luck to you. Good, but that's higher risk, it's higher effort. That's actually taking on more of a job versus the, potentially the smarter money is on, 2 or 3 really nice ones in a great area and just let them do their work over the decades.
So there you go, folks. What investor are you? Are you a short-term supply and demand chaser, or are you doing it over the long term? There's a link here. You can check out a podcast that Ben and I recently did on this very topic, where we go into it in some length. And of course, tune in each and every week to the Property Couch every Thursday, 3 o'clock Australian Eastern, either Standard Time or Daylight Time. So which investor are you?